Okay, chapter 27, part 2, the respiratory system. We're going to be talking about the lungs today. So, red blood cells exchange gases at capillary beds. Basically, oxygen diffuses out of the red blood cells and out of the capillaries into the tissue surrounding the capillaries, and CO2 diffuses in and is also carried by the hemoglobin back to the lungs, where it is released out into the environment. Gas exchange happens several different ways in different groups of animals. Some animals exchange gases across the body surface or via tubules connected to the atmosphere, like the breathing spaces along these insects, the grasshoppers. They have these little things, little holes called spiracles, and they breathe into the general cavity. Air comes in with oxygen, and it just goes into that single cavity that's being circulated by the open circulatory system. These guys, earthworms, basically oxygen diffuses in, CO2 diffuses out close to the surface. Okay. In fish, you have water flowing one way, okay, and as it goes, the water has a lot of oxygen, and oxygen moves into the bloodstream, and it's always just going by basic diffusion, because the water, even though some moves out in that area, further down, there's always going to be less oxygen in the blood vessels in the gills than is in the water. And then the most complex and the most efficient would be mammals and birds. We have these little alveoli sacs or alveolar sacs in the lungs that are covered by little capillary beds. And as we breathe in air, oxygen diffuses out of these sacs into the bloodstream, and CO2 diffuses from the bloodstream into the sacs. And as we exhale, the CO2 leaves. Lungs are the main respiratory organs in humans. Air enters the respiratory system through the nose. You have these little bones in the nose called turbinals, and they basically cause turbulence in the nasal cavity. And this allows the mucous membranes, which tend to be kind of moist, to attract and have foreign particles filtered out of the air before it gets down into your system. It also, because there's a lot of blood vessels up here in your nasal cavity, which reaches far back into the skull, warms up the air. Okay? So the air is warm, and then as we breathe out through the nose, it pulls the warmth out of that air so that the air is not as warm, and we conserve heat in our bodies. All right? Also the mouth, but when you breathe through your mouth, you don't have as many protections as breathing through the nose. From there, it goes into the pharynx, which is and from there into the trachea, and you have the little epiglottis that covers. The pharynx here is a common area between your digestive system and your respiratory system, and you have a little epiglottis, a little flap of tissue that covers the trachea, so when you're swallowing food or water, it goes down into the stomach. But when you're doing air, it opens up and air enters through this trachea and into a set of 23 branching airways that eventually end in alveolar sacs where gas exchange occurs. Now, here is some actual lungs that have had all the tissue dissolved with a weak acid, leaving all these bronchioles and bronchi showing. And you can see basically from here, that's the first branching, and then this will branch, and they continue to branch 23 times. Here is an alveolar sac. Now there's a little bronchiole, okay, and air moves into these little alveolar sacs where it diffuses into the blood. The oxygen does, and the CO2 diffuses out. These are very tiny. Now, there is muscle tissue, smooth muscle. It's autonomic, so your nervous system handles this for you. It can contract or dilate, and sometimes you'll have a bad allergic reaction, and these bronchioles will contract, and it starts getting very hard to breathe. Okay? The little alveolar sacs are a single layer of squamous epithelial tissue, and it's always moist. You've got water being secreted because moist cell layers diffuse oxygen and CO2 a lot better and a lot quicker. And then you have little surfactants that are formed in these alveoli, and the surfactants break the hydrogen bonds between water molecules in here so that you can expand the alveoli. Breathing requires pressure changes. Air flows from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. When we inhale and exhale, air pressure in the lungs changes. Basically, breathing is not so much sucking air in and out, it's expanding the lung or squeezing the lung. And the diaphragm, which is a layer of muscle down here, when we breathe in and air is coming in, this diaphragm moves down and allows these lungs more space. So as the lung size expands, it's like this balloon. And as the lung size can expand, the pressure in the lungs is less than the atmospheric pressure. And so the atmosphere flows into the lungs. And then when you exhale, you've got all this volume of air in your lungs, and the diaphragm lifts up and helps squeeze out that air during exhalation. Summary of airflow: contraction of diaphragm. Air flows into the body, nose, mouth, trachea, bronchus, bronchiole, and alveoli. Gas exchange at the alveolus, relaxation of the diaphragm, and then air flows out of the body. Red blood cells carry most carbon dioxide and oxygen. There is a little dissolved as a solute in the blood. Oxygen diffuses into the blood at the alveoli and diffuses out of the blood at the tissue cells. CO2 diffuses in the opposite direction, from the tissues into the blood and then out at the alveoli. Red blood cells also transport much of the carbon dioxide in the blood, and within red blood cells, CO2 is converted to this carbonic acid or bicarbonate. This is part of the blood buffer system, so you have a lot of CO2 in here, and you have carbonic acid and you have bicarbonate. So, if your blood gets too acidic, okay, here's your blood buffer system equation. So, if you remember when we talked, we talked about pH in 1010. pH is determined, the acidity of a solution is determined by the number of free hydrogen ions. The more of these hydrogen ions, and a hydrogen ion just means it's a proton without an electron orbiting it, okay? That's very acidic. That determines how acidic it is. So if your blood is too acidic, meaning too many free hydrogen ions, they use this bicarbonate to combine to the hydrogen, and it becomes carbonic acid. The carbonic acid is a weaker acid, and so your blood pH will become more basic or alkaline. Your pH will move up. From 6.9 down are the acidic pHs, from 7.01 up are the alkaline or basic ranges. So your blood's too acidic, you got to get rid of some of these hydrogen ions, so you combine it with the bicarbonate to make this carbonic acid. Carbonic acid makes it less acidic. But let's say your blood gets too alkaline. Well, then you can take some of this carbonic acid in your bloodstream and break it up into free hydrogen ions plus a bicarbonate. And so this is constantly going back and forth, and there are little oscillations. If you were looking on it on a graph, it would be little oscillations going up and down, right? And it's constantly adjusting your pH. And so CO2 plays a huge role because we make that carbonic acid by adding carbon dioxide to some water. Okay. And that's all we have for part 2 of chapter 27, your respiratory system.